And so I think without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dan Benoit, who's already introduced himself, and he's going to be speaking to us today about Red River Métis agriculture and food systems. So Dan, over to you, please.
Okay, I don't normally use this technology. We use MS Teams. So yeah, hi, I'm Dan Benoit, and I'm going to be talking about Red River Métis agriculture and food systems. And I will get going, but before I start talking about the Red River settlement, it'd be remiss of me if I didn't talk a little bit more about agriculture on the prairies prior to colonial settlements within North America or contact. So I just want to bring to everybody's attention that there was this rich trading system that happened north, south, east, west amongst Indigenous people prior to contact. And these were very extensive. So we see tobacco, we see corn, we see potatoes, and in the case of whelk shells, we actually find whelk shells in the Red River area, Lockport, which we'll talk about in a sec. So this blue area, the blue circle, the blue circle is the Red River area, and those are the two sites that I'm going to quickly talk about, which is the Lockport site, which was an archaeological site. They figure it's 1,250 years old, and then the Olson site near Melita, Manitoba, which is about from the 1400s. The 1250 and 1400s. That they're 800 years old. So at the Lockport site, they found corn kernels and stalks and bison scapula, so tools and actual things that were grown. Olson site, they didn't find things that were grown, but they found in the fires themselves burnt burnt corn and things like that from actually frying it up and things. And but they also found really cool is a tool making facility, and I use the term facility, loosely. But they were actually making these tools there. And what's really interesting is that the tools that they're making are actually very similar. So it's probably the same group of people between Lockport and Olson. But they don't come from they don't have similarity to North Dakota, South Dakota. They actually have more of a similarity to Wisconsin. So that was pretty interesting to see. And so this is the second one I wanted to show you, is that this is how they feel the corn and tobacco spread throughout North America. So again, that really mimics these trade routes that we see here, right? And that's pretty cool. And the clay urn that you see, the ceramic urn, the clay urn that you see here is actually something that was actually found um, at the Lockport site. And it has a Thunderbird on it, which is really, really interesting. And so they feel that corn spread from Mexico in just 1,000 years across North America, essentially. So I just wanted to draw your attention, because normally when we think of heritage breeds and seeds, we normally think that they go from South Central America and North America to Europe first and then come back. And there's quite a lot that actually come through these trade routes, north and south, potato being an example. And so the question I have is, how would we characterize these seeds that never left Turtle Island, right? Like, we usually term old seeds as being heritage seeds or heirlooms, but is that an appropriate term to use in this case? So anyways, I'll just leave it there. This is super cool because this is actually a bison scapula. So this was used as a hoe, and you can see the mark in the center, which is the hole for the stick handle. And so that's really cool because you can imagine, like, I'm just watching this person actually hoeing with this. It's a very sophisticated piece of instrument here, right? This is just as good as an iron hoe. So, and again, they're very similar to what's going on in Wisconsin. And I have a question for Anthony later if he wants, but why did these instruments come from Wisconsin and not immediately south in the North Dakota, South Dakota area? Was it because of the Iron Confederacy and the Blackfoot Confederacy not always getting along, right? I don't know. So I'll leave that out there as an open question. But in addition to agriculture that First Nations were doing prior to Europeans coming to North America on the prairies in southern Manitoba, is that we also see that fire has been used for since time immemorial as range management for bison, right, for buffalo. And there's a really good article, or very good master's paper by a fellow named Rani from the University of Winnipeg, who looks at fire. He looks at all the Hudson's Bay and all the other records from the early explorers and the priests and things like that. And he writes down, he takes all the quotes out of there. And it's really interesting that the Indigenous perspective versus the early explorer perspective on fire and fire use couldn't be more drastic. So the explorers are saying this is wasteful, why are they doing this? Why are they burning perfectly good wood? And without realizing that this was a form of range management for, to keep the willows down and to keep the aspen down so that there is more prairies, new growth. So it's good for the bison. It's a way of herding them into one space so that that you're going to be able to easily hunt them because they're attracted to that new area. So anyway, so this is really interesting because this is the dichotomy we have between what people write about things Indigenous people have done on the landscape versus sensible reasons why it was done through oral tradition and other capturing of that knowledge, right? We knew that there was good ecological and food related reasons to do these things, to have fire on the prairies. So I just wanted to leave for a thought here is that bison as a prairie ecological and cultural keystone species is super important to Indigenous people. And I think this is going to become one of the driving factors on the prairies when it comes to not just rematuration, but reconciliation, I think. And this could help the reason why we're here today about biodiversity and sustainable farming and things like that. And so the bison or buffalo rematriation is going to be key to the restoration of healthy, resilient prairie habitats, in my opinion. So that's pre-contact. Now let's talk about after contact, but before the Selkirk settlers come in and settlement actually happens. So in 1792, you have a group of First Nations who come out of Sault Ste. Marie area, probably Garden River or close by, and named Chief Peguis. He's pretty famous here in Manitoba. And he brings along with him 200 people of his members, and they settle essentially in the St. Peter's Parish area. I want to just talk a little bit about settlers. Okay, so we normally have a negative connotation when it comes to settlers because we think of colonial settlement. One of the ways that the British Crown exerts imperialism over people, but in this case it's actually Indigenous people themselves who are settling on the land and farming and things like that. So I just wanted to draw to your attention a slight distinction between when we use settlers in this context, it's different than white settlers. Okay. And with the Métis, when they bring with them the traditions from their area, which is the growing of various crops. In 1806, which is the earliest record that we can find of written down about Métis agriculture at Red River, it actually happens a lot earlier than that on the Saskatchewan River. But in the Red River itself, it happens in Pembina, North Dakota, which is just across the boundary here. And the Métis were there en masse until the border is drawn up in 1818. And they have to choose which side of the border they wanted to be on, and they came up to the Forks essentially and started populating that area a little bit more. Then you have the Selkirk settlers come in 1814, and Lord Selkirk, he bought his way into the Hudson's Bay Company, and then he turned around and granted himself a settlement grant. And he was a philanthropist. He was, I think, I think he thought he was doing the right thing. I don't know if he was doing it for his own personal reasons or just out of the goodness of his heart. But he brought these people over in order to settle in the Red River area. And immediately, when they did come, immediately Miles McDonell saw that they were starving, and they proclaimed the first Pemmican Proclamation. And which essentially said it prevented the people of the Red River area, so the Métis and the First Nations, Peguis specifically, from allowing pemmican, which is bison meat that's dried up and pounded, and then you can add berries. In winter, you would add, fat to it, lard, and it's a very nutritious. It's like jerky, but not quite jerky, but you get the idea. And other country foods and grown or raised foods from leaving the settlement. And they wanted everybody to sell their surplus to the Hudson's Bay monopoly. So this marks the start of something called the Pemmican Wars. And there's a reason why I'm telling you all this, is because you'll see how the way that we've created market systems has disrupted how the normal way subsistence agriculture actually works with Indigenous people. So I'm going to read this. The Selkirk settlers who arrived at Red River that year were unprepared, undersupplied, and because lacking necessary survival skills, incompetent. They were accorded provisions, shelter, and training by the Métis already present in the area, but after 3 years of aid, the newcomers' presence become burdensome. A Cree term, munias, originally applied to Selkirk settlers to identify them as strangers. However, it quickly came to be a synonym for unhandiness or uselessness at the settlement. And you'll see why in a sec. But this discontentedness, this almost flippantness by Miles McDonell and the Hudson's Bay Company and the settlers themselves of, coming in and taking over and telling the Indigenous people, you can do this, you can't do that, it's like bossing them around, didn't sit very well with the Métis. And so what happened is in 1816, you have something called the Battle of Frog Plain. Most Manitobans know it as the Battle of Seven Oaks. And before anybody who speaks French criticizes me for my poor spelling of French in the top, that's actually French machif. And you can see that the first word is Cree, and the next 5 are French, dans, D-A-N-S, la prairie, de la gournorière. So grenouille is the French word for frog, but that's how the Métis, so that's machif French. The pronunciation's really, really quite different. And it's worse than, say, a Newfoundlander speaking English. If you go to some very small hamlets in Newfoundland, it's really hard to understand what they're saying. Well, this is even worse if a French person was listening to a French machif speaker, because very, very different way of speaking or pronouncing things. But the other thing that happened, which was really interesting, so that was the first battle. That was the first struggle against HBC and colonial imperialism and monopolies. And then you have the second one that happens, which was the Sayre trial in 1849. And he was charged, Sayre was charged with selling into the States some pemmican and bison and some, raised agricultural goods and things like that. And so he was put on trial, but because the Métis were armed and surrounded the courthouse with 300 people on horseback, they found him guilty, but they did not levy a fine. And because of that, the Métis said on the day, le commerce est libre, free trade. And so with that, essentially came to an end that part of the Hudson's Bay monopoly that had occurred up until then. And I just bring this to your attention because this was my team knows that I'm an avid reader. I read the news. And this was in the news feed today about the top grocers testifying in Ottawa. They're seen as being an oligarchy, which is a monopoly with very few players in it, I guess, is an oligarchy. And so the Canadian food system right now is seen as being too big, too much of an oligarchy, the Monsantos, those Simplots, McCain's. And so it's interesting that the Métis fought against this type of thing back in the day. So turning to, a little bit less tongue-in-cheek here, well, maybe it wasn't tongue-in-cheek, but this is really, really interesting because it shows that the Europeans that come into the settlement as Selkirk settlers, they don't last very long. They leave because they don't have the skills, they don't have the background, they have no technical skills. They don't know the knowledge of the land or the landscape or any of the traditions. They try to use European technology, implement seeds and breeds that are not appropriate. So they just tried to import Europe or Britain to the Red River and the prairies, and it was a total disaster, right? And other things that possibly could have accounted for this also is the lack of capital. These people were very poor. They couldn't actually buy anything. There's nothing to buy because everything was made in the settlement, right? So if it wasn't already in the settlement, it was expensive to buy from Britain and have it shipped in, right? So, but partly because of lack of external markets, and I think we use this all the time. People are trying to run before they can even walk, and in this case, crawl. And so the other thing that is pointed out, and I'm using from a really good book. It's called A Casualty of Colonialism, and it's by Dr. Norma Hall, and I think it's probably the best article out there that talks about early Red River prairie farming prior to the wave of the white settlers and the white agricultural people. And so if you ever get a chance, I just Google that, and if not, I'll put it in the chat as other people are talking. But there was something called model farms that the Hudson's Bay Company tried to do, and it's very similar to, I think, the experimental farms that we have today that some provinces run, and even a little bit like the research development centers that we have. And they tried different technologies and everything, but these ones were more with an eye to making certain people rich. They were like just crazy ideas, and I just want to read this one. So take, for example, the second model farm established by Selkirk in 1817, which was the first one being cancelled before it began. So William Laidlaw of Scotland was paid a generous sum to oversee the project. Servants and well-bred livestock were brought in. Workers were hired, but the enterprise folded after several unimpressive years. By 1824, all traces of farm property, implements, livestock, and even large buildings had disappeared. The central mansion, so they built a mansion, right, have cost £600 to erect, had completely burned to the ground in a drunken frolic. Any items not destroyed while the farm was in operation had likely been informally redistributed throughout the settlement. The Hudson's Bay Company was out of approximately 2,000. So we had a whole bunch of these early model farms or these experimental farms. And again, they weren't there for the right intentions. They were there more to make certain people, risky schemes to make people profitable, and not so much on doing the right thing to innovate for the settlement. So let's turn to the Red River Métis now. So what's really important here is that we're going to be looking at 13, 14, 15 here in a sec. The Peguis is up here in 23, 24, and yeah, half the settlement is English. Oh, and the Selkirk settlers were in around 19 here, I think. So slowly these parishes get filled out by English Métis and French Métis. And this whole area explodes after 1821, after the merger between the two, Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. But let's talk about Métis agriculture, because it was part of a seasonal food harvesting cycle. So the French Métis in blue here would all gather St. Norbert's, St. Vital, St. Boniface, and they would head south to Portage, Pembina, North Dakota, and they would kind of go across and then meet up in the Grand Butte in this area in South Dakota. The English Métis in red here would congregate in around Whitehorse Plains, Portage la Prairie area, and then they would also come south, just coming through Turtle Mountain. And also, so they would gather up together. Sometimes they would be apart depending on how big the grouping was, the ox carts and the number of people. But then they would go on their summer hunt. And as the bison got smaller and smaller, they would have to go further and further. And that's what I tried to, demonstrate here with the purple arrows. So they would, so there was a bison hunt that was during the summer. They would come back in the fall. They would go, and the green arrows here show that the English Métis would go to St. Laurent and Oak Point on the south side here and fish. And the French Métis would go to Grand Marais, Fort Alexander, the south side of Lake Winnipeg. So Lake Manitoba, Lake Winnipeg. So they would fish there. They would come back. They would do a small bison hunt just for their own food, and they would harvest what was in their gardens, and then they would winter over. In the spring, they would plant their gardens. They would go on their spring fishing. They would come back, they would prepare, they would be looking after the gardens again. They would prepare for the summer hunt. And not all the Métis actually went on the buffalo hunt. Probably only about a third, they figure, third to a half of the community. So the rest that stayed behind would look after everybody else's houses and cows and chickens and things like that. And so what's really interesting is, we think of the Red River Métis as being buffalo hunters, but actually only a certain portion actually ever went on the buffalo hunt. But everybody had a farm and everybody had a garden. And so I would like to throw out there, that the Métis were actually more farmers than they were buffalo hunters in some way. The brown here shows that they also played laborers of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. So, and we'll talk about this in a sec because it's a mixed economy. So here's just some pictures of what I'm terming Métis inventions: the Red River wooden frame house, York boats, the river lot system. On the bottom right is what we call the Manitoba Curl Toboggan, because it goes back more on 180 degrees onto itself. Yeah, pretty cool. And then the Métis, what was interesting about the Métis is that when we were born as a people, we were born, as you know, out of white Hudson's Bay and Northwest Company voyageurs and traders and stuff like that, with First Nations women. And so those kids, which were the first generation, not quite Métis yet, they were actually employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, and on a whole series of things, including supplying supplies to the Hudson's Bay Company on a commercial basis. So let's get into St. Norbert. Remember I showed you, I said, okay, there's St. Norbert Parish. Well, this is hard to see, but this gives you an idea of what the St. Norbert Parish looked like. So this is the Section 32 lands, which is the farm homesteads. They were in between 4 and 12 chains wide, 40 to 400 acres when you take into account that the farm went back 2 miles, and then the haylands themselves went back up further 2 miles past that. So that kind of gives you an idea of the size, even though the amount of land that was broken for crops and for cereals and hay was actually a lot smaller than that. And we'll talk a little bit, but it was essentially 1 acre per person as far as gardening and cereal crops and things like that. And what's really interesting is that Stats Canada still shows these Métis farms as being small, mixed, and not the primary source of income. Like I introduced myself, right? Small farm, I had off-farm employment, and it was really more about a culture. It's part of our cultural makeup rather than a commercial endeavor. And what's really interesting about Métis today, because I worked at the MMF, it was that I was the ag coordinator, and what we saw was that Métis people, and I suspect most Indigenous people as well, and Anthony and others can talk about this, but we're not so much worried about maximizing profits and production. Of course, we want to be able to make some money and provide for our family and things like that. But other imperatives are more important, like doing the right thing for the land and working with Mother Earth and all our relations rather than against and trying to be superior or over nature, over the land. And yeah, so in that sense, it's cultural. It's doing the right thing. It's biodiversity. It's all those other things that we see as side benefits, essentially. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, and I talked about it briefly, is that the Métis were actually just as much farmers as they were buffalo hunters because of this mixed economy. And a lot of historians, even to this day, discount that Métis are actually real farmers because we didn't quite have the same nicely, maintained crops and garden beds and things like that. For some reason, we're seen as being lesser farmers, right? And there's reasons for that, as far as not putting too much effort into the farm itself, because there's other things that are important, like going out and hunting, trapping, fishing, right? There's other things to be done rather than just putting all your eggs in the agriculture basket. But I just wanted to point out, the wider world of agriculture also includes field crop, livestock, poultry, and other commercial production. As this Dr. Norma Hall's research has shown, the historic Red River Métis in community practice mixed farming or diversified agriculture. They raise vegetables, fruits, field crops, livestock, and poultry. And whenever that was possible, they would market, some of the surplus production. So anyways, I thought that was kind of cool. And this is an artist's rendition of what those, a yard site beside a built-up church area, school area would have looked like on the river.
Hey Dan, just letting you know we're pretty over time, and I can give you about one more minute.
We're over time already. Oh my God! Oh, sorry.
No worries. Okay. No worries.
Okay, Métis women, super important, and they actually run the show. They actually, there's lots of evidence that the Métis women were big players in all of this. But also in the Red River, we discount harvesting of the wild, and in the Red River, what would happen is people would have their they wouldn't cut down all the trees and everything. They would take what was out there and they would harvest those as well, in addition to the agriculture that they're doing. And I just wanted to show this. There's huge amounts of flour and pemmican, and it was a very sophisticated economy, and you can see how much everything's growing. And this shows that the Métis, this is all the jobs that the Métis in blue had within the Hudson's Bay Company. So that's the off-farm work. Here's the Métis farms that are getting bigger and bigger as time goes on. This is Métis talking about themselves and comparing themselves to the Americans and the American way of getting big or go home, which is pretty cool. This is another person who talks about the Métis and just can't believe this, they farm today, hunt tomorrow, and fish the next. I've used this one before. Hopefully we're going to be sharing these presentations. Within the settlement itself, though, it was really, really, really hard agriculture. So here's all the examples of all the partial and full-on crop failures because of frost, locust, droughts, flooding, and fires. So here's really good from Rani. This is all the fires that happened in the Red River over a 100-year period. Pretty cool that we have this type of data available to us. I'll just, so this is important because really it's shared family and cultural norms influencing the Red River agriculture. And it's unfortunate I can't speak a little bit more about this, and the land ownership is different too. So the seigneuries out east where people actually own it, and then they try to get people to be their labor, and then you have wealth accumulation and people using other people. That never happened. That's not part of our way of doing things, nor is it a First Nation way of doing things. And so everybody owned the land, everybody looked after their own property, and there was no excess labor to offer to other landowners so that they could get richer and richer off of other people's. And this was seen by racist people at the time as regarding the Indian principle and the Métis habit of sharing as ancient usages that were wanton and reckless perversions of hospitality. So they saw it as a bad thing. Non-Indigenous people saw this principle as being a bad thing. And there's just some cool pictures I thought I'd share. So this is my last slide, so I'll read it out because I think it really does a good job of summarizing. So Dr. Norma Hall's work is, I think, the most complete historical accounting of Red River Métis and First Nations Peguis knowledge systems in this modern, we'll call it settler, right? I explained that, agriculture in Western Canada. And the Red River Métis and Peguis First Nation were the innovators, were the people that actually did the work and actually applied it. Not white settlers, not the Hudson's Bay Company, not the Catholic Church, despite the current narrative out there that this is all modern white settler farmers that have, de-wilded the West. So Red River Métis Farms is part of a broader food system that we talked about. We were everything. And they were small mixed endeavors that took into account cultural norms, the sharing of harvest, the looking after family and community, biodiversity, climate realities, labor shortages, 1-to-1 ratio for acres per person in the family. And it was not all just done by Métis men, but it was done by Métis women and children, which is pretty cool. And the early Hudson's Bay settlers, using European technology, knowledge, and implements and farms, they all failed. And yet the Métis farms and the First Nation farms, Peguis farms, all thrived until it was all taken away of us after 1870. And but what's really cool is that Fallham and Nichols, who have done research since then, took a look at these Métis farms from the early settlement era, and what they found using stats and talking to Métis producers and everything else when I was working back at the MMF in 2006 was that Métis farms and the cultural norms and thought patterns and the decision making that goes into the Métis producers, those things haven't changed in the last 200 years. Okay, sorry about my being over time.
No worries, no, thanks so much. And I know we got off to a bit of a late start because we did some intros and we had some tech problems there. Just going to remind folks, we are going to go through the break. I'm hoping we're not going to lose a lot of folks as a result, but